Hi. Welcome to Wandered Family Guest Room. We this used to be my daughter's room, but she has moved off to Cal Poly to go to school, and it's kind of made it clear she's not coming back. Anyway, I think a lot of you do that when you walk to college too. I did that. I'm still in San Diego. Interesting. So we this weekend painted and redecorated in here. Nice. Anyway, my wife's cleaning out her closet, so I'm talking to you in here. Um, so I'm going to go through your questions, and I'm going to try to answer all the questions from chapter 2 that I can. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the brain. I'm probably going to pause and then record and then start recording again, talk more about the brain, answer your questions that you've posted already, and then I'll get to the rest of the ones later tonight or tomorrow. Like my glasses, I like these because they're like safety glasses. They're like progressive, so I can adjust my focus by moving my head. So freaking cool. Oh, share screen. Excellent. Okay, let me go back to here. All right, so what I'm gonna do is kind of scroll down and ask about your questions. Okay. All right, so Juan, intelligence, or how smart someone is just a measure of their choice of behavior, really. So it all depends on the situation. It all depends on the person's interaction with the situation to determine how smart their behavior is in a particular time. Um, I like to do things that are slightly stupid. I do because it's fun. I don't know why, but I do. Like go skiing and have one giant ski pole. Why? I don't know. It's just fun. So what seems stupid to one person might actually be stupid to someone else. Kind of interesting. Um, okay, is it possible to improve common sense through psychology? I think common sense is not learned through psych. Common sense is learned through paying attention to the world. So you can learn to pay attention to the world through the principles of psych. You can learn to observe behavior and not judge people, which then improves your common sense. The more you start interacting with people and the more you start dealing with lots and lots of different people, the more intuitive the world becomes. The less interactive you are with more people, the more difficult the world is. That's a really good question. Can learning psychology help identify the science behind people's mindset? There's a lot of cool research, Miriam, about mindset. Um, I have a very positive mindset. And as a result, I kind of get things go away a little bit that probably shouldn't. But that's because I just generally think positively about things. But there's a lot of research on that called efficacy and self-esteem and self-control. Those things are really relevant and current in today's research. And if you start looking into those, you can really see that a lot of mindset is what's called mindfulness or positive psychology. Cool stuff. That's we talk about near the end of the semester. Well, 20 days from now. What ways psychology can help us learn about ourselves? Dima, the way we learn about ourselves is by learning a vocabulary. This course gives you a whole set of ways to use words to describe ourselves. We're going to add semantic space, and the semantic space is ways to describe who you are to yourself. And when you learn how to describe who you are to yourself, then you have a more accurate definition of yourself. Weird. So like if I understand that the color of this wall is white, well, it's not really white. It's called soft chamois, I think. And it's a soft chamois 50%. No freaking idea. But what it is, it's that the idea is that we wanted white, but we don't want a cold white. We want a warm white, but we don't want a bright white. We want, I don't know. Sometimes I don't understand paint. Now I'm looking in the mirror, I can see a spot up in the corner up here that we missed. Anyway, so is it possible for psychology for bad desires, for criminals to make decisions, behave based on psychological science? Fatima, yeah. Psychology I always say this can be used for good and evil. A lot of people that are like traffickers or people that are trying to manipulate kids and manipulate adults and form cults and form religious sects, they all use really good psychology. Donald Trump is really good at using psychology. He uses a very basic form of manipulation that makes people follow him. And it works really, really well. He's really good at it. And that's because he follows the science of making people follow him. It's really good. Okay. How can someone using psychology know if they're doing a good job by picking someone's brain or understanding their behavior? Um, Most psychologists, once you have the training, that's when you start picking people's minds and analyzing their behavior. Before, you're not really supposed to do that very much. If you try to do that too much on a daily basis, you're really judgy. What we start to learn is that not to judge people so much, but just to see them where they are, see them where they're at, and help them find where they are. And that's so that you don't really pick their brain, you just kind of listen to their behavior. I like that. Apart from naturalistic observation, which type of approach would you recommend to reduce behavioral changes during a study? Oh, that's a very concrete question. I love doing real manipulative experiments where you manipulate one variable and you have everything else the same. We've been doing this a lot in our research lab, and to me, it's a lot of fun. It's a ton of work. The results are not very generalizable, but they're very cool. Surveys work really, really well too. But the more things you can control, the more things you're in control of and organized, less variables there are, the better it is. Science is about facts. Then how can scientists be able to predict the future? Miriam, you ready? Probability. Science is about collecting data and analyzing the data and looking at probabilities. So what we can do is there's something called Bayesian inference, is where you can look at what you've done in the past and look at what your situation is now and make a prediction about the way the future is going to be. Doesn't mean you're going to be right. It just makes a prediction. And a lot of predictions are what we call sort of accurate. So a lot of predictions, in psychology, we use 95% accuracy. 95% is great, but it's not 100%. So physics and like chemistry, they're pretty close to 100%. In physics, you can predict something and pretty much know what the answer is going to be. But in psych, we only accept 95% because humans are really interesting. And we can't really predict what someone's going to do. We can make a good guess and make a good hypothesis, but we don't really know what they're going to do because other variables might show up that we're not aware of, things in their past, all sorts of neat stuff. So predicting the future is not really rocket science. It's just having enough data and looking at probabilities. Remember, probability doesn't mean cause, it just means likelihood. Between genetic, environmental factors, how they affect influences behavior. So I like that question a lot. There's something called epigenetics. Epigenetics are where the environment triggers the release of certain proteins from certain genes. As a result, you get a lot of genetic variation based on environmental events. So someone who is susceptible to post-traumatic stress and lives in a post-traumatic in a very traumatic environment is more likely to develop a post-traumatic stress disorder. Someone who has the genetic propensity for post-traumatic stress but doesn't live in a stressful environment has a lower probability of producing a post-traumatic stress disorder because the genetics play a role in the environment, and the environment plays a role on the genetics. It's really interesting. Oh, sleep and dreams. We're going to talk a lot about that next. So dreams are subjective. Dreams are not exactly something that exist. They exist in our consciousness, and our consciousness creates the story of the dream. And when you try to explain a dream to someone, it just doesn't quite make sense. I had a dream a couple of weeks ago that I still remember vividly, that we had a pet velociraptor and it attacked our dog. Now, why we had a pet velociraptor, I'm not sure. And why it attacked the little dog, I'm not sure. And then I woke up and little dog was bleeding, and that's all I got. Very strange. Scientifically analyzed, no freaking clue, because it's all subjective. It's all inside my head. But we can look at electroencephalograph. We can look at brain activity, which I will show you next week. And because I don't have the EEG here, it's in my office. But when we can look at the electrical activity of the brain while the person's dreaming and map out the patterns, and then watch the patterns as they're running through the day to see if there's any relationship between the patterns that they're dreaming and the patterns throughout the day. The answer is yes, but um, how does the brain work? I don't know. Um, sorry, that's not a good answer. Uh, the brain basically is 86 billion cells. Each of those cells releases chemicals in response to electrical stimulation. Each of the electrical stimulation is a product of those chemicals being released by the cells. It is amazing. Um, and then the next one is a really good question. How do children learn to speak when they're young? Through observation and feedback. Observation and feedback. That's all they need. And they can, the more you talk to your kid, the better their language will be. The more they sit in front of a screen, not so much. Which method is most often used? Okay, so these are kind of cool. Those are kind of questions that you guys can just figure out. I want you to ask more complicated ones, like some of the ones before. Those are really good. Okay, but Mildred, the best method for use of psychology study human behavior is watch them. Observational data is the best thing that we can have because you can see what behaviors are going on, you can measure the environment, and you can make direct relationships. Oh, Katie, that's a really interesting question. The science behind electrical shock therapy. Turns out that if I cause a seizure in your brain, you have a feeling of euphoria afterwards, or a feeling of horror, depending on where the seizure located from. But that feeling of euphoria, they decided to try to treat patients with this new thing called electricity, which caused the patients to have this altering experience by having their brains completely seizured. The problem was the old original ones used to break bones, and people would get burns, and the yelling and the biting and screaming. Anyway, but now they anesthetize the person, give them muscle relaxants, and then and they electroshock the brain, and it really does alleviate depression and some severe types of schizophrenia for a couple months. Pretty interesting. Let's see. How can psychology help us better understand our minds, how we think, and our mindset? I said this before, Travis, but it gives us a new vocabulary. Um, by giving us a new vocabulary, we have words to describe the way that we feel. This is why a lot of kids can't communicate how they feel. They don't have the vocabulary. They don't have the words. They don't know what to say. We have a big discussion about with one of my friends who is a therapist. She happens to speak Arabic. There's not a lot of words in Arabic for different emotions and feelings. So if you're trying to do counseling in Arabic, there's not a lot of vocabulary for inner workings of your thoughts. There just isn't. And as a result, it's hard to do therapy. Same kind of thing in Spanish. And so you have to teach people a new set of vocabulary words so that they can understand the way that they're feeling and be able to communicate the way that they're feeling. But because once you understand something, you can then start controlling it. Does environmental factors how we answer psychology questions? Yes. So Salome, sorry, if I give you a personality test right when you broke up with somebody, your answers will be different than if you hadn't just broken up with somebody. If I give you a stress test right during finals, your stress test is going to be different. So a lot of times personality changes based on what's called sociogenic aspects. But it also is affected by biological aspects and ideological aspects. Ideological aspects are the way that you want to be. The way you want to be affects how you answer the questions on a psychology test. What's going on in your environment affects it, and your actual biology affects it. It's complicated. That's why we have a whole semester to deal with this. Or you guys, 21 days. All right. How does your memory work? How often do we forget important things? I'm very terrified of this as I creep into age. Memory works by activating cells, and those cells become long-term activated. So when the same information comes again, the cells fire and give you a feeling, oh, I know this, which then reconnects all those bits and pieces together to form the memory. We often forget things generally because we don't remember them properly, we don't store them properly, or we're not paying attention. That's my big problem. Ooh, we're going to talk a lot about emotions in a couple of weeks. So your question about psychology measuring emotional intelligence, I'm going to get to that in a little bit later because that's really interesting, but we're going to cover that later in the class. But it's a very good question. Okay, Carolina, I just kind of mentioned this before. Childhood trauma changes the way your brain responds to a chemical called cortisol. So cortisol is a stress hormone, and that stress hormone activates your brain, which causes the world to seem like it runs in slow motion. It also can cause dissociation, like out-of-body experiences. It's a way of your body protecting itself from very serious problems. But in children, it can rewire the way that their brain works so that later on as an adult, they might have more difficulty emotional regulating things because the part of the brain that cortisol seems to work is the emotional regulations. Again, we're going to talk a lot more about this later in the semester. What's the science behind therapy being effective in some people but not others? Oh, I love that question. So behavioral outcomes as a result of therapy depend on so many variables, so many different things. It's really hard to measure effectiveness because some people don't buy into the therapy. If you go to a therapist that doesn't seem to jive with you, ugh, you just like, this person's an idiot. But other times you just have to talk to the person once and you're like, oh, there we go. And then everything's fine. So there's too many variables. Every single individual is different. Everyone has a different past. Everyone has a different backstory. And as a result, we don't know exactly what's going on. Pretty interesting. Okay, so Hannah, dopamine is a transmitter in your brain. It's released when you have pleasure or happiness or joy. It's right behind your nose, right between your eyes, about this far back into your brain. It's called the ventral tegmental pathway, and it tells you what you should and should not do. So dopamine is both psychological and physiological. Physiological, it's used in your body because it helps constrict blood vessels. That's why when you use drugs that stimulate a lot of dopamine, like for example, cocaine, you snort it, it constricts all the blood vessels. And so you start eating away at the blood vessels in your nose. Or the people who smoke meth or smoke crack, their teeth fall out because it constricts all the blood vessels in their gums and their teeth don't get any nutrients and they get all nasty. Yeah. Don't use meth. So it's not really a personality that changes or copes with trauma. It's much more of a brain chemistry. And certain people will manage their trauma better. And most important thing, it's social support, the people around you. What are the key principles, Asano? I like this question. I love cognitive psych. I teach cognitive psych in the spring. What are the key principles of cognitive psych? How do they contribute to our understanding of thought process and behavior? Key principles of cognitive are that the mind exists within our thoughts, and that we pay attention to memory and attention and sensation and perception and language and argument and problem solving. All awesome. So much fun to teach that class. How much of our current actions and beliefs are impacted the way humans lived 1,000 years ago? Aiden, I really think that we're the same dang folks that were here 10,000 years ago. I don't think humans have changed very much. Yes, we've got better hygiene. Yes, we've injected silicone into various parts of our bodies to look different. But honestly, the same problem society was having, if you read old ancient texts, the same problems they were having then and the same problems they're having now. The same things that philosophers were arguing about then, philosophers are arguing about now. People said that the wheel would make people lazy because it made people work less. I don't know. The internet's making us lazy. We're thinking less. Who knows? I think it's the way that we are now is the same as we were then. We just have more tools. And the internet. Ooh, and bicycles and smartwatches and insulated coffee mugs. Back in the old days, you had to drink coffee while it was hot. Now, It's not, it's actually tea. I'm cutting back on my coffee consumption. It really pisses me off, but it's okay. Research studies scraped over complications of the study. Our research studies ever scrapped due to complications? Yes, Giovanni. Um, if there's complications, the data is no good. If you don't, I've had multiple students tried to do research and they screwed something up. And you can keep the data. I have the data, but there's no way to analyze it. There's no way to use it because the way that they ask the questions, the data is meaningless. So, like, we did an experiment about, what was this one? Oh, one of my students wanted to listen to different types of music while we quit English, took personality tests to see if listening to music with angry lyrics made people answer differently than if it had positive lyrics. The problem is that when she was done and she collected all the data, and then she forgot to label which group what listened to what music. So when she's trying to do the analysis, she had this giant spreadsheet, and we had no idea who listened to what music because she forgot to put that in the computer. Lots of data, useless. Okay, so, oh, I like this. I don't think any, Lydia, I don't think any, Alita, sorry, anybody is exactly the same. We all have the same basic principles. You'll learn this throughout the semester that we all have the same basic responses to things, but everybody's individual responses are completely different. It's very interesting that the individual differences make us more interesting than how we are the same. Psychology does not count as a science. It's more qualitative than it is quantitative. So as a result, I don't think I'm going to have to bug your math then. 2 plus 2 doesn't always equal 4. If I have 2 pairs, then that equals 8. It's all about context. So every single situation is slightly different. So what we use is we don't use quantitative, logical, mathematical responses. We use probabilities. So we use this Bayesian inference, which calculates probabilities of events, not actual measured of events. We can't say this will happen because 2 plus 2 doesn't always equal 4. Because I can say 2 hours plus 2 hours, it equals 4 hours. But what if I changed it to minutes? Then 2 plus 2 equals 120. Huh. So math can be extremely subjective. I'm thinking cookies. No, I'm thinking cookies, but I am. Scientific method applied to psychological research. Always. We have to follow a strict scientific methodology in order to do experiments. Because if we don't, we can't read the results. The results don't make a difference. What scientific methods allow us to master the mind? None of them. How does neuroscience and psychology go hand in hand? Ooh, I love neuroscience. Neuroscience is the study of the brain. Psychology is the study of the mind. And so there's a branch called behavioral neuroscience and cognitive neuroscience. And those 2 branches is where neuroscience hits psychology. Oh, criminology. So lovely. This is really interesting that there's a whole study of psychology called forensic psych. And forensic psych is about measuring people's behavior to find out if they're malingering or they're actually seriously ill. Malingering means that they're pretending to be sick in order to stay in the hospital. So like if you say, oh yeah, I don't know where I am, I've committed these murders, but it wasn't me, it was someone else, and you're pretending to be mentally ill and they put you in a hospital as opposed to the prison, they can tell whether you're malingering or not because that's what the forensic psychologist does. So that's what the criminology of psychology is where they measure and assess things and try to make predictions about behavior. Remember again, the predictions, what we do. Oh, I love this question. How does our mind pick and choose what we really want to do? Um, Are intentions really genuine? I wish I could answer that. Um, there's so many variables. There's something called choice architecture we'll talk about in chat module 7 or 6, I think. How do you choose a behavior? How do you choose what to do? Why did I choose to put oat milk in my tea as opposed to regular milk? So there's so many different things. Intentions, sometimes, I don't know what I mean by genuine. You'd have to really get to know a person to really understand that. All right. So, Melina, this is a really good question as well. What tools are being used to better understand the concept of mental disorders? So that a lot of psychologists are getting together to look at what are the common symptoms of disorders so that we can easily and more readily diagnose disorders. They're called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. So it's all about um, quantifying a mental disorder to the point where you can recognize it based on a set of criteria, which is so important because every single disorder has a slightly different therapy or slightly different medication that would work better for it. And properly identifying the disorder really makes a difference in accepting it or getting it to help. Olga, is there any explanation why your physical health condition depends on emotional health? Totally. We all use the same hormones, and your brain and your body use the same hormones. So if your brain is producing too much of the stress hormones, your body's going to feel the effect of the stress hormones. It's the same thing as if you're running a marathon, your brain can't keep up because the body's stress hormones are affecting the brain. Yeah, and it's exactly that. Um, Okay, so David, this is a good question. I work with research. I work with rats and research for years. Um, we studied the brain and neuroscience and behavior with them. We looked at their brains. We looked at their behavior throughout their lives, and it was really fascinating. All the animals taught or used in research are bred for research. It's because they have to be genetically the same in order to do animal research with them. There's a lot of, you know, urban legends about people stealing family dogs to do medical research on them. Very unlikely, because in order to do any good medical research, they want to use organisms that are genetically all the same. And your family dog ain't genetically normal. So there was one research lab where they released a bunch of beagles. They have been inbred for so many generations. The poor things were really a wreck. But the reason that they were using them is because you take a set of, you breed out any impurities, you breed out any recessive traits, and all you're left with is a stinking white rat. And that white rat is genetically the same as all the other white rats that you get. And that's why we can do behavioral research, is because the only thing that's different is what we're manipulating in the environment, not the actual critter. How does psychologists make sure fair participants? That's a really hard question. We spent 6 months running experiment for our attentional blink, trying to make sure that it was fair and good and safe for our participants, at the same time as making it efficient to collect data. Really challenging, really hard. That's the hardest part about doing experiments. Kristen, yes, more for females than for males, but there's a strong correlation between stress and infertility. So what happens is stress can lower the amount of estrogens and lower the amount of progesterones available for the female, and that can lower the probability of eggs being released and lower the probability of eggs implanting. It's the same thing for male. High stress levels can lower sperm count, which can lower the probability of conception. We've had friends that tried IVF for years and weren't successful, and they ended up moving back home. They were from Sacramento. We ran into them at Disneyland, and they had a little kid. No IVF, just natural. And the reason is because when they got home, everything was relaxed, everything was stressed, and babies. Talk to a healthcare provider if you're having symptoms or problems. Okay. Understanding a client through conversation, have more empirical observations, meaning worse than inductive reasoning. Okay, Zoe, great question. Most psychologists, after they have a meeting, they take down, or during the meeting, they take down tons and tons of notes. And what they do is you go back and read over those notes to look and see what you can quantitate out of them. You can take this talk therapy and make notes about what things are going on. Some of the therapies that work best are something called cognitive behavioral therapy, where you measure thoughts. You measure thoughts as if they are behaviors and you count them. How many times a day did you get distracted? How many times a day did you think about eating cookies? Every time. Anyway, how many times a day do you think about, going on a walk? I don't know. But then when we say, okay, let's count the number of times we thought about it. When you do become conscious of it, we're taking out of that conversation, we're taking concrete evidence and using those concrete evidence to modify and manipulate the way that your behavior is. Deep. Can we use psychology to determine how old someone is? I count the rings, all I can say. Isabel, we're going to talk about this later. It's very much better to be, I should probably say that a different way. It's much better to teach a kid multiple languages when they're young. I have a lot of Chaldean students who have bounced around quite a bit in their childhood, and they can speak 4 or 5 languages, no problem, because they spoke them growing up. Because if your brain is so receptive to new languages, you're so easy to understand them as you grow up. Okay, psychology needs science in order to work. Would it also need math? Oh yeah, Esteban, statistics. Everybody who does psych has to do statistics. Statistics is the only way we can prove anything in psych. And it's so important. And I teach it, and it's great. Okay. All right, I'll record another one a little bit later.